In a little sort of departure from how we normally do things, this year we are very fortunate to have as a prelude to the main lecture Charlotte Mallon, who is coming to speak to us. Charlotte was the winner of the Historical Association's public speaking competition last year, The Great Debate. It's for entrants aged between 16 and 19 years from across the UK and indeed the Republic of Ireland. And they had to respond to the question, what does Magna Carta mean to me? For me, that's quite an interesting one. I grew up living only 10 miles from the cathedral history of Salisbury and can remember as a child being dragged off to see the Magna Carta there by my father, who was far more interested in history than I was. But we're going to hear Charlotte's very impressive presentation, which is both relevant to International Women's Day today and indeed to Parliament. I would like to extend our thanks not only to Charlotte, but to her parents, Julie and Gerard Mallon, who've come all the way from the Wirral with her today, and her school, Upton Hall School, and of course to the Historical Association for making it possible for Charlotte to be here. Charlotte, over to you. Mind the box.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In a broom cupboard, in a crypt, here in the Palace of Westminster, hangs an unremarkable brass plaque dulled by age. It was placed there without ceremony or unveiling. This anodyne little plaque commemorates a stunning act of courage, which our ruling elite would much rather you forgot. At the 1913 Derby, Emily Wilding Davison made a stand for freedom, equality and participation and perished under the hooves of the King's horse. If she was simply campaigning for the right to vote, it would be easy to say that her act does not resonate in a society where women have the vote. However, as Russell Brand says of the suffragettes, they did not die for the right to vote. They died for freedom. Meanwhile, Magna Carta has, over the centuries, become a byword for liberty. But the Articles of the Barons, because let's call them what they really were, agreed to by a beleaguered King John in 1215, merely enshrined the rights of a ruling elite. Oxfam said that in 2014, a bus with the 85 richest people in the world on it would contain more wealth than the collective assets of half the Earth's population. The suffragettes would have been campaigning for equality for those 3.5 billion people. The barons would have been on the bus. The Articles of the Barons ensured that the nobility should pay no more than £100 inheritance tax and that no free man could be put in prison without a fair trial with a jury. Now, the premise of this rule appears to preserve the rights of all people, but it's important to note that the majority of people were not free men. In short, they protected the richer members of society, which equates to only around 15% of the 13th century population. This is not dissimilar to debates we see all too often, and I'm sure you'll all remember the time Britain watched Miley Class bleating onto Ed Miliband about a potential tax on her £2 million mansion. What was she arguing for? Protection for the privileged. She and others like her are modern-day barons, arguing for their own security where the people at the bottom of the food chain don't even get a mention. This does not sound like the freedom and equality that Emily Davison and her accomplices would be fighting for today. What the suffragettes were, and we are still fighting for, is liberation. In their case, freedom was explicitly attached to the symbol of democratic rights, the vote, and the opportunity for women to be involved and to be seen as equals. Their campaign, as you know, resulted in the choice for women, like men, to vote if they so wished. But what these educated, middle-class women really wanted, particularly Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, was equality where not just gender, but class was concerned. The suffragettes focused on the poorer and working classes, who have often been neglected. Why is this? Because our elitist government does not accurately represent the people it governs. This was apparent in 1215, it was true in the early 1900s, and it is even more glaringly obvious now that the gap between rich and poor still exists, as the top 1% of earners are now earning double what they were 10 years ago, where the average income has only increased by less than 2% since 2012. Somebody who does embody the suffragettes' message of equality, and a local example for me, is Julie Hayward. In 1988, she became the first woman to win a case in accordance with the Equal Pay Act amended in 1985. She worked in the Camel Edge shipyard in Birkenhead, and she fought for equal rate of pay as men who did work of the same value. Now, Hayward said that she did not act because she wanted more money. She did it for the simple notion of being the same. Now, whereas her case is not as well known or remarkable as a movement as momentous of that of the suffragettes, what it has the potential to do is empower young women, women in low-paid jobs, and women from small towns, such as Birkenhead. What women such as the Pankhursts, Emily Davison, and even Julie Hayward have done is adapted and activated Magna Carta for a wider proportion of the population than before, which is why, in my opinion, the most remarkable and resonant turning point in our fight for civil liberty is the suffragette movement. When I first learned of the suffragettes, I thought that they were simply campaigning for the right to vote. I was wrong. They were campaigning for They were campaigning for justice and equality on the battlefield that was presented to them in the early 20th century. They were fighting for democratic freedom by pursuing the vote which best symbolised their struggle. Fighting for our democratic freedom today still means fighting for equality. But Emily Davison would not be urging the disempowered people of today to vote. She'd be urging them to challenge the articles of today's barons: profit, bankers' bonuses, and the privileges of the few. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte. Sometimes, and I think one of the most wonderful things about this place is that sometimes you listen to things and you feel properly humbled. I think me, perhaps this evening, because Charlotte was properly prepared and just gave you a fantastic presentation. I think we can all see why she won, and obviously I am not. However, I have to say, it's really interesting, and it is International Women's Day, and I am going to just focus and go off script. This always provokes horror from Melanie when I go off script. But I would just like to give a little example of why this place, perhaps not in accordance with Charlotte's cynicism, but sometimes does work for women. It's not every day of the week that this place works for women, but I'm going to use a fantastic example, and unfortunately she isn't here this evening. But women in this place, I think, sometimes work together a great deal better across the party divide, in spite of the party divide with some of our male colleagues. Fantastic example of that, and I know that Charlotte this afternoon was shown around by Alison McGovern, one of the Wirral MPs, although not Charlotte's own MP. Alison and I both sit on the Speaker's Advisory Committee for Works of Art, but for our sins, and they are many, this week we've been sitting on the HS2 Bill Committee, which the chairman, the two whips, the minister had all decided must finish this afternoon. It could be scheduled to carry on until next Thursday. And at one point this afternoon, we were looking at the clock ticking by, and I suddenly sent a note across to Alison, and I said to her, I have to be out of here by 10 to 6. The note came back, why? Because I'm doing the introduction for the annual Women's Day lecture, and I really have to be there on time, so if I bunk off early, please will you? And that was just a perfect example of how sometimes the women in this place work together, and fortunately we did finish, so neither Alison nor I had to leave early. But I think it is absolutely perhaps evidence of a changing Parliament, and a Parliament where cooperation has increased a great deal more, even if it's just because there are more women and we have more sort of common cause than people might initially think when you compare Alison from the Wirral and me from, as I always say, the deep south. So, the subject of this year's International Women's Day lecture is, of course, as you all know, Eleanor Rathbone, who served as a Member of Parliament from 1929 until her death in 1946. She was a doughty campaigner on both domestic and international issues, and many of those still have resonance today and continue to be subjects that we speak of repeatedly. In some ways I find that profoundly depressing, actually, that all of these years on we're still talking about topics like FGM, about forced marriage, about children, about refugees, and there are topics that Eleanor Rathbone fought on and spoke of then, as did many of her colleagues in the 1930s and 40s, and they're certainly very relevant themes for this year's International Women's Day, which of course is the pledge for parity. In addition to the lecture tonight, we have a small exhibition on Eleanor Rathbone, and after the talk you will have the opportunity to see it. The display has been curated by Vote 100, which is Parliament's project to research and promote the history of women and Parliament, and the Remembering Eleanor Rathbone project. It brings together for the first time the 3 portraits of Eleanor Rathbone, and we are very grateful to both the National Portrait Gallery and to Somerville College for loaning their portraits to hang alongside the one that we already had here in Parliament. Eleanor Rathbone was the first Somerville alumni to become an MP and was followed by figures such as Margaret Thatcher and Shirley Williams. Today, I think there are 6 Somerville alumni sitting in the House, including even one man. We are pleased to be working with Somerville College on the publication of a guide to women's portraits in the contemporary collection, which will be published later this month. This evening, our speaker is Dr Susan Cohen. An historian, Dr Cohen is the author of Rescue the Perishing, Eleanor Rathbone and the Refugees, which was published in 2010. And she is co-founder with Leslie of the Remembering Eleanor Rathbone project, which is this year delivering a wide variety of events and activities, making Eleanor Rathbone better known and appreciated. We are delighted that she has agreed to give this year's lecture.
Good evening, everybody. And firstly, I'd like to thank Caroline Nokes and the Speakers Advisory Committee on Works of Art for inviting me here tonight. As Caroline said, actually, it's especially appropriate for Eleanor Rathbone to have been chosen as the subject of this year's International Women's Day lecture. For 2016 is the 70th anniversary of her death, a year in which the Remembering Eleanor Rathbone Group, this very grand-sounding name, which has been set up by Leslie and myself, are organising a range of events to commemorate and celebrate her achievements. This evening is also special, for it provides a rare opportunity to focus on Eleanor's political career within the precincts of the Palace of Westminster, where she had such an impact during her 16 years as a Member of Parliament. To begin with, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to Eleanor's background and to the nature of her independence. Where the pencil is rolling down, let's get that out of the way before I fall over on it. She was born on the 12th of May 1872, the daughter of William Rathbone VI, a respected, wealthy Liverpool merchant, welfare reform, philanthropist and Liberal MP, and his second wife Emily. That's a picture of their home, Greenbank in Liverpool. So you can get a feeling of they were very comfortably off. The family were nonconformist, both religiously and philosophically, an untypical Victorian family where the sons and daughters were treated equally, where Eleanor and her siblings, 11 in all, were seen and heard, often in the drawing room when politicians and influential figures of the day visited their homes in London and Liverpool. Most importantly, they were taught to respect the privileges that wealth gave them and had instilled in them a deep sense of personal responsibility for the welfare of others, following the family motto, what ought to be done can be done. Eleanor's independent spirit played a huge part in determining her future, from persuading her parents to allow her to be tutored in the classics, to overcoming the subsequent reluctance to agree to her attending university. And there we have a picture of Somerville College, Oxford. Eleanor is the young lady with the tie in the third row back. She became a pioneering student at Somerville College, Oxford in 1893, where she immersed herself in the study of greats, a combination of classics, ancient history and philosophy, the latter introducing her to the idealist school, which stressed practical philanthropy and individual and voluntary service, where her feminism could develop and where she could engage with challenging the status of women and embrace the suffrage movement in the company of like-minded young women. She, like them, envisaged a very different future for herself than that of her mother, but she also knew that most opportunities she considered worth pursuing were closed to women. Deciding what to do with her life was affected by her failure to achieve as good a degree as she or her tutors had predicted. And on her return to Liverpool in 1896, she concluded that she could not, with a clear conscience, immerse herself in academia. Nor could she, as she said, detach herself from all the wrongs in the world, when there were people around her who were clamouring for help. So, in 1897, and at her father's suggestion, she cut her teeth on her first but by no means last piece of social investigation, a study of the casual dock labour system in Liverpool. Poverty and its effect upon the family was at the heart of many of her early inquiries, all were undertaken with meticulous attention to detail and to the recording of facts. This led to a realisation that people involved in collecting this type of information needed formal training, and in 1905 she and her friend and later companion Elizabeth McAdam, the warden of the Victoria Women's Settlement in Everton, opened their pioneering new enterprise, the School of Social Science and Training for Social Work, which offered a 2-year course combining lectures undertaken with practical work, so establishing social work as a new and important profession. That's a picture there of the family, Eleanor's father in the background and Eleanor's on the right-hand side in the background, and some other of her siblings. Alongside this, Eleanor continued to pursue her feminist goal of equality for women, becoming active within and parliamentary secretary of the Liverpool Women's Suffrage Society. She was drawn into local politics in 1909 when women ratepayers were given the right to stand for the city councils. But when she stood for election in Liverpool, she did not presume she would succeed. She wrote somewhat diffidently to her mother, "People seem to think that I ought to be safe to get in, but you never can tell. It is a queer sort of election. The meeting last night was very successful, the room quite packed before it began, and hundreds turned away. But of course that merely means curiosity at the novelty of a woman candidate." Well, she was elected, becoming the first ever woman to sit on the council, and remained as independent councillor for Granby Ward until her resignation in 1935. And that's the election poster for the following year when she was re-elected. During her tenure, she gained a reputation as the city's most prominent women politician, having campaigned and achieved positive change across a wide range of social, welfare and feminist issues. She was responsible during the First World War for organising separation allowances to be paid to wives, but most notably, she launched her pioneering and long-running campaign for a family allowance in 1918, never wavering from the fundamental principle that the benefit was to be paid to mothers, removing some of their economic dependence upon men and recognising their contribution towards bringing up a family. And following her election as President of the National Union of Suffrage and Equal Citizenship in 1919, following the resignation of Millicent Fawcett, she steered NUSEC towards legislative campaigns which were the catalyst for reform, leading to improvements in women's domestic rights, helping to improve their access to pensions, divorce, the guardianship of children, and separation and maintenance from abusive husbands. By the early 1920s, she was able to claim, "Some thousands of women whose names are unknown to us and ours to them will have cause, though they know it not, to bless the National Union for Equal Citizenship." Eleanor had harboured an ambition to stand for Parliament for some time, and had unsuccessfully contested the East Toxteth seat in 1922, losing to the Conservative candidate. When the opportunity arose to stand again in 1929, she grabbed it with open arms. Questions relating to women were very much in the forefront of politics. There were few feminists in the House of Commons to speak on their behalf, and this would be the first time that women under 30 were able to cast their vote. She stood as independent candidate for the combined English universities, and although her electioneering campaign and although her electioneering campaign drew small but interested audiences, made up mostly of women, she did at least go out and canvass and meet potential voters, unlike her fellow university candidates. She won her seat in the so-called flapper election, joining 13 other women, 9 Labour, 3 Conservatives and 1 Liberal, notably becoming the first Somervillian to become an MP, which we've already been introduced to that. And I've got pictures of a few of the women MPs that I was able to find. That was all the Labour women, and then we have 1 or 2 others there. They're not all represented. I'm afraid I couldn't find pictures of everybody. Being a woman in a male-dominated environment, the ratio was 1 to 40, was never going to be easy. Some might say it still presents difficulties. And she had to face many challenges, not least of all because, like other women MPs, she had to endure sarcasm and ridicule from her male colleagues. Added to this was her political independence and university rather than party seat, which could have marginalised her or made her position irrelevant. But from Eleanor's point of view, what appeared to others to be disadvantages worked in her favour, for they provided her with a unique place and platform from which to do what she wanted, which was, to put it plainly, get things done. Politically, she relished her independence and steered clear of party affiliation, for she saw all the parties, more or less, as hopelessly male-dominated and only interested in women's issues if there was the chance they could catch a vote. She had the significant advantage of being financially independent, having inherited money from both her father and her stepsister Elsie, and she also had the practical and emotional support of her companion Elizabeth McAdam. Eleanor soon showed her strength as a parliamentarian and emerged as possibly the most powerful backbencher of the age, becoming masterful at putting down parliamentary questions and using them to force concessions, publicise issues, or to coerce ministers into revealing embarrassing information. She was relentless and persistent, and with no party to exercise control over her, she was almost impossible to keep quiet. Eleanor would indeed go to almost any length in her quest to shape legislation, especially by the introduction of amendments. And that's a picture of Eleanor in Liverpool at a reception after she was actually appointed to Parliament. Those who heard her maiden speech on the 22nd of July 1929 were left in no doubt as to her depth of knowledge and her determination to get things done. She addressed the House on the issue of housing, a subject very close to her heart, using evidence which was, as she pointed out, the fruit of nearly 20 years of theoretical and practical study of the housing problem. Dr. Vernon Davies assured her, on behalf of the House, that we shall always be pleased to listen to her, although perhaps we may not always agree with her. They certainly did not, for many of her male colleagues did not take kindly, for example, to being lectured by a spinster on matters relating to wives and daughters. What they could not do was criticise her for her lack of preparation, for here she excelled. As to her persistence, Edith Picton Turberville commented that Eleanor drove her points home like a sledgehammer, whilst her dowdy appearance, which remained stuck in a bygone age, prompted Ellen Wilkinson to describe her as a great public institution. And she was, as Harold Wilkinson remarked, socially awkward, preferring to spend an evening reading a parliamentary blue book rather than attend a party. Eleanor's new platform enabled her to extend her feminist campaigning to Britain's colonies. From her earliest days of social investigation as a friendly visitor, she had been deeply affected by the evidence of human suffering, and her reading in 1927 of Catherine Mayo's Mother India had a profound effect on her. She was outraged and distressed by Mayo's revelations, and in 1929 she launched herself into a campaign to help save her Indian sister from sexual degradation, child marriage, and discriminatory cultural practices. Eleanor never questioned the veracity of Mayo's claims, nor had she, at this point, visited India, but she believed she had a moral responsibility as an imperialist and a feminist to right the wrongs in Indian society. However, she had underestimated Indian women, and her lack of understanding and well-meant but patronising attitude came back to bite her, as Mayo's tract was revealed as sensationalist propaganda, and Eleanor incurred the wrath of Indian feminists who resented her interference and her mother-knows-best attitude. Chastised but undeterred, Eleanor willingly associated herself with Catherine, Duchess of Atholl, and her campaign to end the practice of clitoridectomy, what we would now know as female genital mutilation, in Kenya. Alongside Victor Cazalet, Conservative MP for Chippenham, she and Atholl formed the Committee for the Protection of Coloured Women in the Crown Colonies, supported by 8 other MPs, including many of the women. If Rathbone's secretaries were embarrassed by her preoccupation with and discussion of these rather horrifying, almost gynecological things that she knew nothing about, one can only imagine what the male MPs made of Eleanor, a spinster, and Atoll discussing this barbaric practice in the House. Even though the late-night debate was apparently very thinly attended, one can only admire the two women for their bravery. There were many occasions when Eleanor collaborated with fellow women MPs. For example, in October 1929, she was in the company of Jenny Lee, Kitty Wilkinson, Edith Picton Turberville, and Lady Noel Buxton in supporting Dr Ethel Bentham present a bill to amend the law relating to the nationality of women. Similarly, she had the support of Edith Picton Turberville, Kitty Wilkinson, and Lady Astor when she presented a bill to secure that proper provision be made for the surviving spouse and issue of a deceased person. But Eleanor's priorities changed dramatically in 1933, the year that James Gunn painted her portrait. When the House of Commons met on the 13th of April to discuss Britain's response to the new Nazi regime, she was the only female politician to speak in the debate, delivering a prescient warning of the dangers that Hitler posed. And this is what she said. "Blind and thoughtless indeed must anyone be who does not see in the events that are happening in Germany an omen for the rest of the world. A spirit has come over Germany. One speaker called it a new spirit, but I would rather call it a re-emergence of an evil spirit which bodes very ill for the peace and freedom of the world. There is one dreadful fact beyond doubt. That is that the party is now in uncontrolled power in Germany and is inflicting cruelties and crushing disabilities on large numbers of law-abiding peaceful citizens whose only offence is that they belong to a particular race or religion or profess certain political beliefs." Here she echoed Austen Chamberlain's words, "Europe is menaced and Germany is afflicted by this narrow, exclusive, aggressive spirit, by which it is a crime to be in favour of peace and a crime to be a Jew." In the subsequent interwar years, Eleanor, who was a member of the League of Nations Union, engaged much more actively with foreign affairs, asking an increasing number of questions in the House as the situation in Europe deteriorated, as Germany rearmed, and as Abyssinia and Italy fell to the enemy. The potential risk to the independence of the countries of the Little Entente became of greater significance, and Eleanor was amongst an unofficial party led by Catherine, Duchess of Atholl, who visited the East European states in February 1937. On her return, she reported to the members of the House saying, "We hear much less about Romania and Yugoslavia than we have recently heard about Czechoslovakia, but these three countries in the Little Entente are our national allies. All three have special claims on us. We're sometimes asked whether this country would be willing to fight for Czechoslovakia if it were attacked. Might we not ask rather whether it would be decent to abandon this country, the last free, enlightened democracy left in Central Europe? Also, would it be safe?" She concluded by saying, "Let those who believe in power politics remember Bismarck's dictum, he who is master of Bohemia is master of Europe." And there was another conflict to consider, that of Franco's military uprising in Spain, and what Eleanor described as the British government's fatal support for a policy of non-intervention. Her susceptibility to human tragedy and her feelings of personal responsibility came to the fore again in late 1937, when she worked with Catherine, Duchess of Atholl, and others in organising the evacuation of several thousand child refugees from the Basque combat zone during the Spanish Civil War. In the following year, the two women were involved in organising the dispatch of dozens of food ships to the Republic's starving and blockaded cities. And when Eleanor and her allies found out in early 1939 that more Republicans were at risk of summary executions and reprisals, and that the British government were unwilling to help rescue them or offer protection for rescue vehicles, they simply circumvented officialdom. Ships were organised to run the blockade, and the National Joint Committee succeeded in getting several boatloads of refugees out and to safety. And when Rab Butler, the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, commented on the lack of a voluntary organisation to deal with entry requests from prominent Republican officials, Eleanor immediately set up and chaired the British Committee for Refugees from Spain, which selected, arranged passage for, and guaranteed support for the few hundred refugees allowed to enter. The child rescue scheme had an enduring impact, for it proved to Eleanor that if enough public support was exerted on the government, then people could be rescued from war-torn countries. It also made her realise that the British would respond generously to any refugee who managed to get to Britain. These were trying times, which Eleanor spelled out in her annual letter to her graduate electors in January 1938, telling them that 1937 had surpassed 1936 as the most anxious, difficult, and in some respects depressing year since I entered Parliament. Little did she know that worse was to come. By now, she was unable to contain her intense dislike of the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. She was resolutely opposed to appeasement, defining it as a clever plan of selling your friends in order to buy off your enemies, which has the danger that a time comes when you have no friends left, and then you find you need them, and then it is too late to buy them back. When, a few weeks later, Chamberlain suggested that the British press exercise restraint in reporting on foreign, i.e. Nazi affairs, she asked him whether Hitler might be appeased if he, Chamberlain, set up a concentration camp for British journalists. Within weeks, in March 1938, the Nazis invaded Austria, and Eleanor knew that Czechoslovakia was now in their sights. The signing of the Munich Agreement on the 30th of September 1938, which handed the Czech Sudetenland to the Nazis, created an immediate and escalating refugee crisis, as thousands of people fled their homelands, seeking sanctuary in Prague. Eleanor was in no doubt that Britain had a direct responsibility for this human disaster, and she saw it as her duty to do what she could to save lives. She devoted herself to trying to rescue as many endangered souls as possible, which was not an easy task. The possibility of a new influx of refugees from Czechoslovakia was unwelcome, as were Rathbone's demands on their behalf. The Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, came under fire over the paltry number of visas that were on offer when she asked whether, in view of the fact that the number of Sudeten German and German refugees of anti-Nazi opinions now in Czechoslovakia and in danger of being driven back into the hands of their enemies is estimated by competent authorities as several thousand, he will consider very substantially increasing the number of 350 permits hitherto granted by his department to enable such refugees to seek temporary refuge in this country pending a scheme for their permanent settlement. And she wanted to know if the government would provide some financial assistance, seeing that this government, she said, has some responsibility in the matter. Following the widely reported and carefully orchestrated pogroms across Germany and Austria on the nights of the 9th and 10th of November, known as Kristallnacht, and to further aid her campaign, Eleanor set up her own pressure group, the Parliamentary Committee on Refugees, in November 1938. This was a purely voluntary committee which she funded out of her own, admittedly deep pockets, whose aim was to influence the government and public opinion in favour of a generous yet carefully safeguarded refugee policy, and to provide temporary reception homes in this country where refugees can be maintained, sorted out and eventually migrated, except in cases where their abilities can be profitably utilised here without injustice to our own workers. Eleanor had a hard core of loyal members and the support of nearly 200 cross-party MPs, and within weeks the PCR were holding meetings almost every day. Eleanor did not agree with the optimistic views on the political situation which were being expressed at home, especially not after she returned from a 6-day fact-finding mission to Prague, first visited in February 1937 and now revisited in mid-January 1939. Her guide and interpreter around some of the camps was Nicholas Winton, who subsequently organised several kinder transports, aiding the rescue of hundreds of Jewish children from Czechoslovakia. He wrote to his mother on the 18th of January about the long talk he had with Eleanor after one visit, and of how he thought she might be able to give a hand with the children when she gets back to London. Without any concrete evidence, I'm afraid we will probably never know if she did in fact give a hand, perhaps by providing financial guarantees for some of the children who were allowed into Britain. Winton also provided an amusing and accurate picture of her when he wrote, "Old Lady Rathbone is still floating around. She's always losing something and causes us endless amusement. She has great energy and rushes around the camps unceasingly." But he was also perceptive, for he remarked that it is good to learn from first hand just what MPs can't do. Just as we, the plebs, spend time trying to influence our MPs, so do the MPs spend their time trying to influence someone higher up. And on her return, and on successive occasions, she berated the government for their policy on refugees, be they from Spain, Germany, Czechoslovakia or elsewhere, and for their failure to do much to relieve their suffering. To be told on the 31st of January 1939 that 650 adult and 160 children had been admitted from Czechoslovakia in the previous 4 months was little comfort when she knew there were several thousand in deadly danger. Appeals like this one to Rab Butler in January 1939 asking him to do something to speed up the mechanism and to relax these regulations which are making it impossible for the voluntary organisation, whose finances were severely depleted anyway, to bring in more than this dribble of people, was a variation on a theme she was to make time and time again. The voluntary Jewish organisations were in fact buckling under the strain of their commitment, made in 1933, to support every Jewish refugee, and getting permission to enter Britain was challenging, as the government had imposed additional quotas and further impediments to restrict entry. MPs and others also heard her oft-repeated plea on behalf of Jews trying to escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. She said, "We should be told that national security must come first. Of course it must, but the question we ask the government to consider seriously is, cannot the method and machinery be improved, not only in the interests of humanity and of the refugees, but in the interests of security itself?" When the House resolved on the 4th of August 1939 to adjourn for 8 weeks, Rathbone voted with the opposition, and in an impassioned speech she called again for a more humane refugee policy, suggesting to departing MPs, "Let us take something else away with us. The thought that while we are enjoying ourselves by sea or mountain, there are hundreds of thousands of men and women who are wandering about in the utmost destitution, many of them hiding by day, many of them already in the hands of the Gestapo and being beaten up daily in concentration camps and prisons." By the outbreak of war, the refugee issue had become all-consuming. Any outstanding visas were cancelled and the possibility of escape was severely reduced. Eleanor's new obligation, to the exclusion of almost any other cause, was the fate of the 71,600 refugees already in Britain, of whom 55,000 were German or Austrian Jews. All were now classified by tribunals as enemy aliens, and even though the majority were designated friendly and left at liberty, those in Category B, around 6,500, were subject to supervision and restrictions. Their treatment struck at the very heart of Eleanor's sense of justice and her belief that Britain's tradition of liberty, generosity and asylum were of profound importance, even in wartime. She lost no time in putting parliamentary questions to the Home Secretary John Anderson concerning the workings of the tribunals and the lack of procedural uniformity, which resulted in many refugees being wrongly restricted and so prevented from working. Individual cases were cited. She wrote letters, arranged deputations, and liaised with her innumerable contacts. Besides being a member of at least 6 other refugee committees, and her ordinary parliamentary business, she was the driving force behind the establishment of the All-Party Parliamentary Action Group, a vehicle for private discussion and action on problems arising out of the war, which by November 1939 had over 50 members. Indefatigable, she took on responsibility for arranging meetings, inviting speakers, and enlisting the support of anyone who showed a modicum of concern for the defenceless refugees. Her reputation for collaring MPs was such that it said they would hide behind the pillars in the corridors of the Palace of Westminster if they saw her approaching, resolute, with her familiar bulging briefcase tucked under her arm. The policy of mass internment, introduced suddenly on the 12th of May 1940, intensified Eleanor's involvement with the refugees. 26,700 people were arrested, mostly at night time, and initially held in prisons or public buildings. They were unable to communicate with their families and had no idea what fate awaited them. Their next destination was one of the many makeshift transit camps scattered around the country, then dispersal to more permanent but unknown locations, which for some was Australia or Canada. Within days, Anderson was being pressed in the House of Commons to speed up the reviewing of internment cases and the censorship of internees' letters. Eleanor vociferously articulated her concerns over the widely reported unsatisfactory conditions in some of the camps, the food shortages, the lack of welfare workers, and the possibility of providing internees with work. 2 suicides at Highton Camp, Liverpool, in early July 1940, and the loss of more than 800 lives on the torpedoed Arandora Star on the 2nd of July, as it transported mostly Italian internees abroad, precipitated an outcry from Rathbone and many other MPs, forcing a debate in the House of Commons on the 10th of July to discuss the government's policy on refugees. This was an extraordinary occasion, for Britain was under very real threat of invasion. But for nearly 6 hours, MPs relentlessly and passionately discussed the issues. Eleanor's arguments against internment were heard loud and clear, supported by other friends of the refugees, but she never lost sight of the priority, which was the safety of the country and its citizens. Like the majority of MPs, she argued that internment was counterproductive, other than in exceptional circumstances. In all, Eleanor put over 80 parliamentary questions on internment alone, many of them to the newly appointed Home Secretary Herbert Morrison. One significant outcome of the debate was that MPs were granted permission to visit the internment camps, and Eleanor wasted no time in doing so. Her first destination was Highton, her home city of Liverpool, an incomplete housing estate hastily surrounded by 6-foot-high double barbed wire fences with armed guards on duty. The visit on the 20th of July had a positive impact on raising the morale of the internees, and one of them, Dr Carl Frankensworth, who'd been in the camp for 5 weeks, recalled how some of the internees had prepared a dossier of complaints, and when an officer tried to prevent them handing it to Eleanor, she interrupted him and insisted on taking the paperwork, giving the men hope that someone cared. As he said, she was a resolute lady who did not miss a chance to show her energy. Eleanor's intervention and action, visiting other camps up and down the country and on the Isle of Man as well as prisons, were effective in changes and improvements gradually being implemented. And due to her action, some of the worst camps, including one at Worth Mills in Bury and Sutton Park, were closed down by early August 1940. Eleanor continued to be burdened with internment issues throughout 1941, undertaking a further exhaustive tour of camps on the Isle of Man in the July. Besides doing her utmost to get these closed down, there were questions in the House on various issues, one about enemy alien women joining the Women's Land Army, for which the major criteria, after questions of security, was the necessity for them to speak English. There were also regular questions about specific groups of enemy aliens, often precipitated by her liaison with organisations, including in the case of academics and scholars, the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning. the Board of Deputies of British Jews found her to be a highly effective advocate and conduit for deputations and parliamentary questions, especially as she was not Jewish and could not be accused of favouring her co-religionists. The internees in Australia were a continuing source of concern, especially as there was a prevailing public misconception that these people were dangerous characters. In parliamentary questions in May 1941, she asked Herbert Morrison why the Australian authorities had still not, after 9 months, lifted the ban on internees sending cables. She felt that the regulation worked very cruelly. But Morrison, whose attitude towards these men was out of sight, out of mind, thought that she was somewhat exaggerating the gravity of the situation. Domestic refugee matters continued to overwhelm Eleanor, but she kept the bigger issue, that of attempting to save even a few of Europe's Jews, firmly in her mind. She was well informed about the Holocaust, with news reaching her from sources including the YMCA representatives in Geneva. But it was the immediacy of information that the Vichy government in October 1942 were complicit in the planned deportation of Jews, including thousands of children, to certain death, that precipitated a desperate bid to save them. Eleanor instigated a deputation of humanitarian activists, which included churchmen and politicians, who met the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, on the 28th of October. He had secured cabinet permission to admit into Britain those Jewish children who had a near relative here, although the cabinet, as Frank Roberts of the Foreign Office put it, said, could see no reason why Jews as such should have preferential treatment. The outcome was that Morrison decided that only children with parents in Britain could enter, and those of nationals of Axis governments in exile, equally with Jews. As he was informed that there were probably fewer than 20 such eligible Jewish children in France, the cabinet agreed that orphans and children of deported parents could also be admitted. Morrison saw this as a major concession, but Eleanor and the deputation were devastated, prompting her to report subsequently, Mr. Morrison's reply was completely negative in substance and ingracious in form. Some thought it offensive. Her secretary, Mary Thorpe, who was at this deputation, clearly agreed, noting how Morrison's responses were full of the usual anti-alien rhetoric that asserted that Jewish refugees were not the only consideration, that Britain in wartime could not open the door to refugees any wider, and that Hitler would always make more victims than the country could absorb. With incontrovertible evidence of the mass extermination of Jews in Poland having reached Eleanor and officials by November 1942, her remonstrations and those of the pro-refugee lobby became part of a much wider debate in Britain, which the government found increasingly difficult to ignore. Foreign Office papers reveal that Eleanor regarded the proposed joint United Declarations on the Jews, which Eden subsequently read out to the House on the 17th of December, as wholly unsatisfactory, and failed to offer a lifeline to any refugees. When Eden totally ignored Eleanor's straightforward call for a post-declaration debate on the refugee question, she looked for other ways of attracting attention and set up a new pressure group, the National Committee for Rescue from Nazi Terror. Her aim was to raise awareness of the Nazi atrocities amongst the general public and to see what practical measures could be taken to rescue Jews, no matter how small a number this might be. As an outcome of her determined activism, she was accused in certain quarters of being tainted with the refugee brush. So although she was the driving force behind the National Committee, she disguised her leadership role, not very effectively it must be said, behind the presidency of the Marquess of Crewe. She then produced a variety of publications, including her 12-point programme published in April 1933, which the government dismissed out of hand. She produced a regular informative news sheet, News from Hitler's Europe, and a booklet, Rescue the Perishing, in which she set out to answer all the well-rehearsed anti-refugee arguments. Eleanor attended more deputations and continued to harangue officials, determined to raise the profile of the endangered Jews. In late 1943, Her attempts to persuade the BBC to broadcast a talk to mark the first anniversary of the Allied Declaration, in which the public would be reminded of the scale of the atrocities, elicited a negative response from W.J. Haley, the editor-in-chief. The behind-the-scenes view was that, and this I quote, "As on all questions affecting Jews is so largely coloured by emotion, it will be ill-advised to broadcast any direct expression of opinion or appeal for sympathy." Early March 1944 found Eleanor actively seeking the support of Roosevelt's recently established War Refugee Board, whose plans for rescue mirrored those she had set out. But this was overtaken by news of the Nazi invasion of Hungary and the 750,000 or so Hungarian Jews in imminent danger of extermination. And within 6 months, between 500 and 600,000 of those souls had been murdered. Eleanor's speeches and letters displayed her utter despair at having failed to do more to save lives. And as the war drew to a close, she turned her attention to the surviving remnant of Europe's Jews, vociferously opposing plans already set out in the Allied Declaration in 1942 for their compulsory repatriation. Then she had said, "Is it really contended that Jewish refugees from Germany, Romania, Poland will mostly be willing, or can with any humanity, be forced to return to countries where their families have been massacred, their homes expropriated, and where anti-Semitism is deep-rooted? Or that white Russians can be repatriated to Soviet Russia, or Republican Spaniards to Franco Spain?" The only light in an otherwise bleak place was her family allowance campaign, which her cross-party contacts had given new life to in the late 1930s and 40s as it became part of a commons-based anti-poverty alliance. But when the Family Allowance Bill was published in February 1945, it was clear that the government were going to stipulate that the money was to be paid to the father. However, they totally underestimated the strength of feeling and public sentiment and were faced with an unexpected cross-party backbench rebellion. At the second reading of the bill, Eleanor was allowed to initiate the debate in the light of her standing as the grandmother of this proposal. The payment to the mother, she said, was of immense importance, and if the wording was not amended, she would refuse to vote, even though, as she said, "I have worked for this thing for over 25 years." When it came to the third reading, she had to be wheeled up to the bar of the Commons, having been unwell, but the wording had been amended, and the Family Allowance Act finally passed on to the statute book in June 1945, with the first payment made in August 1946. Post-war, and despite being utterly exhausted, Eleanor was actively involved in Victor Gollancz's Save Europe Now campaign and was reasserting her support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine when she died suddenly on the 2nd of January 1946. In conclusion, I have to say that I've really only been able to give you a very broad picture of Eleanor's career, but I hope it will have inspired you to want to engage with some of the other events being organised this year. And the last words go to Nancy Astor, who remarked in the House in 1945 in respect of the Family Allowance Bill, but which is equally relevant today. "It's very difficult when we look at the Honourable Lady Member for the English Universities to think of her as a revolutionary, but she is, and it is her work and her vision and courage that have really brought us where we are today." Thank you.